What if I told you that one word, spoken in a smoke-filled room in 1931, nearly ignited a war that would have rewritten the entire history of American organized crime? A single racial slur, uttered by the most powerful gangster in America, came within seconds of ending his life and fracturing the most sophisticated criminal enterprise the country had ever seen.
The year was 1931, and America was drowning in contradictions. Prohibition had turned the country into a nation of criminals, where ordinary citizens broke the law every time they wanted a drink, and the people who supplied that drink became millionaires overnight. The stock market had crashed 2 years earlier, plunging the nation into the Great Depression, yet the illegal alcohol trade was booming. Millions of Americans were out of work, standing in bread lines, watching their savings evaporate, while gangsters like Al Capone were pulling in over $100 million a year. It was a world turned upside down, where criminals had more money than banks, where local politicians took orders from bootleggers, where the law was whatever the man with the biggest gun said it was. And nowhere was this upside-down world more evident than in the relationship between the Italian Mafia and the emerging black underworld of Harlem. Al Capone was, by 1931, the most famous gangster in American history. His name was in the newspapers almost daily. His face was recognizable to millions. He had survived assassination attempts, gang wars, and federal investigations. He controlled Chicago like a personal kingdom, with hundreds of speakeasies, breweries, and bordellos all feeding money into his operation. Police captains, judges, and aldermen were on his payroll. He threw lavish parties, wore expensive suits, and walked the streets of Chicago like he owned them, because in every way that mattered, he did. But Al Capone had a problem, and that problem was that his empire, for all its power, was fundamentally unstable. He had built his organization on violence and intimidation, on the principle that the man who hit hardest won, and that strategy was starting to fail him. The violence that had served Capone so well in the 1920s was becoming a liability in the 30s. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where 7 men were machine-gunned to death in a Chicago garage, had shocked the nation and brought unprecedented heat from federal authorities. Newspapers that had once treated gangsters like colorful rogues were now calling them animals and demanding action. J. Edgar Hoover at the Federal Bureau of Investigation was making the destruction of organized crime a personal crusade. And the various Italian crime families, instead of presenting a united front, were tearing each other apart in brutal wars of succession. Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano were locked in the Castellamar's War, a conflict so bloody that it was threatening to bring down the entire structure of Italian organized crime. Bodies were piling up in the streets. Businesses were being destroyed, and the federal government was watching all of it with increasing interest, looking for any opportunity to bring the whole criminal enterprise crashing down. Into this chaos came a man named Charles Luciano, though everyone called him Lucky. Lucky Luciano was everything that Al Capone was not. Where Capone was loud and flashy, Luciano was quiet and calculating. Where Capone loved publicity, Luciano avoided it. Where Capone built his empire on raw violence, Luciano understood that sustainable power came from organization and diplomacy. And Lucky Luciano had a vision for the future of organized crime in America that was radical, revolutionary, and deeply threatening to old guard bosses like Capone. Luciano believed that the various crime families should stop killing each other and start cooperating. He believed that territory should be divided rationally, that disputes should be settled through discussion rather than machine gun fire, and that the criminal underworld should operate like a corporation, with a board of directors making decisions collectively rather than individual bosses ruling through terror. It was a beautiful vision. It was also completely naive about one fundamental aspect of the world Luciano was trying to organize: the deep, visceral racism that defined American society in 1931, including the criminal underworld. The Italian Mafia in the 1920s and 30s was an exclusively white organization. That wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was policy. The various families saw themselves as Italian first, American second, and criminal third. They maintained strict ethnic boundaries, rarely working with Irish gangs, viewing Jewish criminals with suspicion, and treating black gangsters as beneath consideration. This wasn't just personal prejudice, though there was plenty of that. It was strategic. The Italian mobsters believed that maintaining ethnic solidarity was essential to their survival. They spoke Italian in their meetings so police informants couldn't understand them. They recruited from their own neighborhoods and family connections. They married within their community. They saw themselves as separate from and superior to other ethnic groups. And this strategy had worked brilliantly for decades. The tight ethnic bonds made infiltration by law enforcement nearly impossible and created a sense of loyalty that was stronger than any contract. But it also created a fundamental problem. What do you do when someone from outside your ethnic group becomes too powerful to ignore? Harlem in 1931 was undergoing its own transformation. The neighborhood had become the cultural and economic center of Black America during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. Poets, musicians, writers, and artists had flocked there, creating an explosion of creativity that had transformed American culture. But Harlem was also desperately poor. The Depression had hit black communities harder than white ones. Unemployment among black workers was double that of white workers. Landlords charged black tenants more for worse housing. Banks refused loans to black businesses. The legal, legitimate economy was systematically closed to most black Americans. So they created their own economy, and a huge part of that economy was illegal. The numbers game, an illegal lottery where people bet pennies on three-digit numbers, became the economic engine of Harlem. Thousands of people placed bets every day, hoping their number would hit and they'd win 600 times their bet. It was hope in a world that offered very little of it. And the woman who controlled that hope, who ran the numbers game with an iron fist and a brilliant mind, was Stephanie St. Clair, the woman they called Madame Queen. Stephanie St. Clair was extraordinary by any measure. She had immigrated from Martinique, arriving in Harlem with nothing, and within a decade had built a numbers empire that cleared $50,000 a week. She was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly fearless. When police tried to shake her down, she had them investigated and exposed. When rival gangsters tried to muscle in on her territory, she fought back with everything she had. She hired the best lawyers, paid off the judges who could be bought, and had the ones who couldn't bought investigated until they begged to be transferred out of Harlem. She understood that in a world designed to crush people like her, survival meant being smarter, tougher, and more organized than anyone else. And she understood something else too, that she couldn't fight alone. Running an illegal gambling empire required more than intelligence and determination. It required muscle. It required men who could collect debts, protect operations, and send messages to people who thought a black woman would be an easy target. It required an enforcer who was feared, respected, and loyal. It required someone like Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. It required Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was 25 years old in 1931, and he was already a legend in Harlem. He had been born in South Carolina, but Harlem had made him. He arrived as a teenager with nothing but intelligence and ambition, and he learned quickly that in Harlem, the rules that governed white society didn't apply. Here, if you were smart enough and tough enough, you could build something. Here, being black wasn't an insurmountable obstacle, it was just another problem to solve, and Bumpy Johnson was very good at solving problems. He started as a runner for the numbers game, collecting bets and delivering winnings. He was smart enough to never steal, tough enough to handle confrontations, and observant enough to learn how the business actually worked. Within 2 years, he was managing runners. Within 4 years, he was Madame Queen's chief enforcer. And by 1931, he was becoming something more, a power in his own right, a man whose name carried weight, whose reputation preceded him, whose intelligence and strategic thinking were making him indispensable not just to Stephanie St. Clair, but to the entire black underworld of Harlem. But Bumpy Johnson had a problem, and that problem was that Harlem didn't exist in isolation. The numbers game that sustained the black community was enormously profitable, and that profitability had attracted attention from people with more guns, more money, and more political connections than Madame Queen could ever hope to have. The Italian Mafia had looked at Harlem and seen an opportunity. They saw thousands of people betting millions of dollars every year. and they wanted that money flowing into their pockets instead of black pockets. Dutch Schultz, who ran operations in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, was already making moves into Harlem, using violence and intimidation to take over Numbers operations. He would approach Numbers bankers and give them a simple choice: work for me and live, or refuse and die. Many took the deal. Some refused and disappeared. And Stephanie St. Clair watched all of this happening and understood that she was facing an existential threat. Dutch Schultz had more men, more guns, and more political protection than she did. In a straight fight, she would lose. So she needed to make sure it wasn't a straight fight. She needed allies. She needed protection. She needed someone in the Italian mob who would be willing to tell Dutch Schultz to back off, someone powerful enough that even Schultz would have to listen. She needed Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano had been watching the situation in Harlem with great interest. He saw the Numbers game and recognized its potential, but he also saw something else, an opportunity to test his vision for organized crime. Luciano believed that the future of the mob was cooperation, not competition. He believed that fighting over territory was wasteful and stupid when there was enough money for everyone if they just organized properly. And he believed that the ethnic barriers that defined the Italian mob were not sacred principles, but practical obstacles that could be overcome if it served everyone's interests. Luciano had worked with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. He respected their intelligence and understood that having allies outside the Italian community made his organization stronger, not weaker. So when Stephanie St. Clair approached him through intermediaries and proposed an alliance, Luciano didn't dismiss it out of hand like most Italian bosses would have. He listened. And the more he listened, the more interesting the proposal became. Stephanie St. Clair was offering something that Luciano desperately needed: intelligence. Her Numbers operation employed hundreds of people throughout Harlem. Her runners heard everything, saw everything, knew everything that was happening in the black community. And the black community knew things about the white community that white people never suspected. Black people were maids in the homes of wealthy businessmen and politicians. They were porters on trains, hearing conversations that white passengers assumed were private. They were janitors in office buildings, finding documents in trash cans that people assumed had been properly destroyed. They were drivers, bellhops, kitchen staff, all invisible to the white people they served, and therefore privy to information that would be enormously valuable to someone like Lucky Luciano. Madame Queen was offering to share that intelligence in exchange for protection from Dutch Schultz. She was offering to pay tribute, to acknowledge Luciano's authority, to operate under his umbrella rather than independently. And she was offering to deliver the cooperation of the entire black underworld of Harlem, to bring organization and stability to a territory that had been chaotic and violent. It was a good deal. It was a great deal. But it had one enormous problem. It required Luciano to extend his protection to black criminals, to treat them as partners rather than prey, to tell Dutch Schultz and every other Italian gangster that Harlem was off limits because he, Lucky Luciano, had made an alliance with a black woman and her black enforcer. It required him to break one of the fundamental rules of the Italian mob, that you never, ever put a black person on the same level as a white person. Luciano thought about this problem for weeks. He discussed it with Meyer Lansky, who told him it was brilliant but dangerous. He discussed it with Frank Costello, who warned him that the old guard bosses would see it as betrayal of everything the mob stood for. He discussed it with Bugsy Siegel, who said he didn't care about race, but warned that a lot of Italian soldiers did care and would see the alliance as weakness. Everyone told him the same thing. The idea was smart but politically toxic. And Luciano, being Luciano, decided to do it anyway, because Luciano understood something that most of the other bosses didn't, that the world was changing, that prohibition would eventually end and the mob would need new sources of income, and that alliances with people outside the traditional Italian community would be essential to survival. So in the late summer of 1931, Lucky Luciano sent word to Stephanie St. Clair that he was willing to meet with her and her chief enforcer to discuss terms. And that meeting, held in a Harlem restaurant late at night with only a handful of people present, changed everything. Bumpy Johnson walked into that meeting knowing that his life depended on making a good impression. He was 25 years old, meeting one of the most powerful gangsters in America, and he knew that Lucky Luciano would be judging every word he said, every gesture he made, every indication of whether he was smart enough and tough enough to be worth protecting. Stephanie St. Clair had coached him for days. Be respectful, but not servile. Be confident, but not arrogant. Show intelligence, but don't show off. Let Luciano see that you're capable, that you're strategic, that you understand the larger game being played. And most importantly, understand that Luciano is taking an enormous risk by even meeting with you, and make it clear that you understand the value of loyalty, that you honor agreements, that you can be trusted. Bumpy listened to all of this and understood that what Madam Queen was really telling him was, don't let your pride get us killed. So when he sat across from Lucky Luciano in that Harlem restaurant, he spoke carefully, answered questions thoughtfully, and demonstrated through his words and bearing that he was not just muscle but a strategist, someone who thought 3 moves ahead, someone who understood power and how to wield it. Lucky Luciano studied Bumpy Johnson throughout that meeting and came to a conclusion that surprised him. This young black enforcer was smarter than most of the Italian soldiers Luciano commanded. Bumpy understood things intuitively that Luciano had to explain to his own men. He understood that violence was a tool, not a goal. He understood that reputation was often more valuable than actual force. He understood that the key to power was making people want to cooperate with you rather than forcing them to cooperate. And most impressive of all, he understood that this meeting wasn't really about the numbers game in Harlem. It was about Lucky Luciano's larger vision for organized crime, about whether the Italian mob could evolve beyond its ethnic boundaries, about whether the future of the underworld would be cooperation or continued warfare. Bumpy got it. He understood the stakes. And he made it clear to Luciano that he and Madam Queen would be the kind of partners Luciano needed, reliable, discreet, and smart enough to understand when to push and when to back down. By the end of that meeting, Luciano had made his decision. He would extend his protection to Stephanie St. Clair's operation. Bumpy Johnson would be considered under Luciano's umbrella, meaning that any attack on Bumpy was an attack on Luciano himself. And Luciano would send word to Dutch Schultz and every other Italian gangster that Harlem was now organized territory, and anyone who wanted to operate there needed to go through the proper channels and get approval. It was done. The alliance was formed. And now Luciano had to sell it to the other bosses. The commission was Lucky Luciano's greatest achievement and his biggest headache. He had created it in 1931 after orchestrating the assassination of Salvatore Maranzano, the self-proclaimed boss of all bosses, whose attempt to dominate all of organized crime had nearly destroyed everything. Maranzano had wanted to rule like a dictator, demanding tribute and obedience from all the families. Luciano had killed him and replaced his autocratic rule with something revolutionary, a board of directors for organized crime. The commission consisted of the heads of the 5 New York families, plus representatives from other major cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit. They met regularly to divide territory, settle disputes, and make rules that all families would follow. It was brilliant in concept. In practice, it was a constant struggle to keep powerful men with enormous egos from killing each other. And now Luciano was going to tell these powerful, proudly Italian, deeply racist men that he had made an alliance with black gangsters and expected them to honor it. He knew it would be controversial. What he didn't fully anticipate was how violently some of them would object. The meeting was scheduled for November 17, 1931, at a restaurant in Little Italy that had been cleared of customers and surrounded by armed men to ensure privacy. The heads of the 5 families would attend. Luciano representing his own family, Joe Bonanno, Joe Profassi, Tommy Galliano, and Vincent Mangano. From Chicago, Al Capone would be present, along with Frank Nitti, his enforcer. From Detroit, representatives of the Purple Gang. From Philadelphia, Angelo Bruno. It was the most powerful gathering of criminals in American history, men who collectively controlled billions of dollars in illegal activity, who had hundreds of police officers and politicians on their payrolls, who could order murders with a word and have them carried out within hours. These men met in a private room with a long wooden table, expensive wine, Cuban cigars, and an understanding that what was said in this room would determine the future of organized crime in America. Lucky Luciano arrived early, as he always did, and took his seat at the head of the table. He had notes prepared, arguments rehearsed, responses planned for every objection he anticipated. What he hadn't planned for was Al Capone's mood. Al Capone arrived at that commission meeting in a foul temper. His empire in Chicago was crumbling. Federal prosecutors had finally found a way to get him: income tax evasion. The trial was set for the following month, and Capone's lawyers were telling him that the government had a strong case. For the first time in his life, Al Capone was facing the real possibility of prison. Not a comfortable arrangement where he'd serve a few months in a friendly county jail while his lawyers worked out a deal. Real prison, hard time, years behind bars with no control, no power, no empire. The man who had terrorized Chicago, who had ordered hundreds of murders, who had bought and sold politicians like merchandise, was about to be brought down by accountants and tax returns. It was humiliating. It was infuriating. And it made him dangerous because Al Capone in a good mood was unpredictable and violent. Al Capone facing prison was something else entirely. He was looking for fights. He was looking for opportunities to assert dominance. He was looking for someone to blame for his problems, someone weaker than him that he could crush to make himself feel powerful again. And when Lucky Luciano started talking about his alliance with Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson, Al Capone found his target. The meeting began normally enough. Luciano discussed territory arrangements, profit sharing from various operations, upcoming labor union negotiations. The bosses listened, asked questions, offered suggestions. There was disagreement, but it was civil, professional. These were businessmen discussing business. Then Luciano brought up Harlem. He explained that Dutch Schultz's attempts to take over the numbers game there had been creating unnecessary violence and attracting federal attention. He explained that the black numbers operators had approached him about an arrangement. He explained that he had met with them and found them to be intelligent, organized, and willing to pay tribute. He explained that he was proposing the commission officially recognize Harlem as organized territory under his family's protection, meaning that all Italian operations there would need to be approved and coordinated. It was a straightforward proposal, the kind of territorial arrangement the commission approved all the time. Except this time, the territory was controlled by black criminals, and that made all the difference. Joe Bonanno spoke first, his voice careful, diplomatic. He asked whether Luciano had consulted with the other families before making this arrangement. Luciano admitted he had not, that he had moved quickly to prevent further violence. Tommy Galliano asked what tribute the Harlem operators would be paying. Luciano named a figure, 25% of gross profits, same as any other protected operation. Vincent Mangano asked whether the commission would have oversight of the numbers operation or whether it would remain independent. Luciano said it would remain independent but subject to commission rules and arbitration. These were reasonable questions, the kind of details that always needed to be worked out. And then Al Capone spoke, and the entire tone of the meeting changed. Capone had been drinking, not drunk, but enough to loosen his tongue and lower his inhibitions. He had been sitting quietly, smoking his cigar, watching Luciano with growing irritation. Because what Luciano was proposing wasn't just a business arrangement. It was a fundamental challenge to the racial hierarchy that men like Capone took for granted. Capone had built his empire on the assumption that white men, and specifically Italian white men, were superior to everyone else. That was the natural order. That was how God had made the world. Black people existed to serve, to labor, to be exploited. They weren't partners. They weren't equals. They weren't even fully human in Capone's view. And now Lucky Luciano, this upstart boss who was barely 40 years old, was sitting at the commission table and proposing that they treat a black woman and her black enforcer as if they were legitimate business partners, as if they deserved protection, as if they were worthy of respect. It was offensive. It was disgusting. It was an insult to everything Capone believed. And because Capone was angry about his legal problems, because he had been drinking, because he was looking for a fight, he said what he was thinking without any filter or calculation. "What did you call him?" Capone asked, his voice cutting through the polite discussion. Luciano turned to him, confused by the interruption. "Called who?" "The enforcer," Capone said. "This Bumpy character you're so impressed with." "What's his full name?" Luciano hesitated, sensing danger but not sure where it was coming from. "Ellsworth Johnson. Ellsworth Johnson. And he's a what exactly?" "He's an enforcer for the numbers operation in Harlem," Luciano said, keeping his voice neutral. But what is he? Capone pressed. What does he look like? Luciano understood now where this was going, and he tried to deflect. He's a professional operator. I met with him and found him to be intelligent and capable. But he's black, right? Capone said, the word dripping with contempt. This whole arrangement you're so proud of, this alliance you made without consulting any of us, it's with a bunch of people that the word hung in the air for a moment. And everyone at the table knew what was coming, knew it was a disaster, knew that it should be stopped, but nobody moved fast enough, and Capone finished his sentence with a word that changed everything. It's with a bunch of people, and then he used it, the SLUR, the word that in 1931 was used casually by millions of white Americans, but which, in this room at this moment with these stakes, became something else entirely. It became a challenge. It became a line drawn. It became a test of whether Lucky Luciano meant what he said about loyalty and partnerships, or whether it was all just pretty words that disappeared the moment someone like Al Capone decided to assert white supremacy. The room went silent, completely, utterly silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every man at that table understood that what had just happened was catastrophic. Al Capone, one of the most powerful bosses in the commission, had not just questioned Luciano's alliance. He had insulted it in the most demeaning terms possible. He had made it clear that he viewed Bumpy Johnson not as a professional criminal worthy of respect, but as something subhuman, something beneath consideration. And he had done it in a way that directly challenged Luciano's authority and judgment. If Luciano let this pass, if he allowed Capone to use that word and dismiss his alliance, then every other boss at the table would understand that Luciano's promises were worthless. If he couldn't protect Bumpy Johnson's dignity, then he couldn't protect anything else either. The alliance would be dead before it started. Dutch Schultz would move into Harlem with the commission's implicit blessing. And Luciano's vision of a more organized, less violent, more cooperative criminal underworld would die with it. But if Luciano responded, if he defended Bumpy Johnson and confronted Capone, then he was risking a war with one of the most violent, unpredictable men in organized crime. He was putting himself and his family on the line for a 25-year-old black enforcer from Harlem that most of the men in this room had never met and didn't care about. It was a terrible choice. And Lucky Luciano made it in less than 3 seconds. Luciano stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically, but deliberately. He placed both hands flat on the table and looked directly at Al Capone. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but absolutely clear, carrying to every corner of the room. Say that again. What? Capone said, suddenly wary. He had expected Luciano to be embarrassed, to back down, to make excuses. He hadn't expected this. Say what you just said again, Luciano repeated, his voice still quiet. I want to make sure everyone in this room heard you correctly. I want to make sure there's no misunderstanding about what you just called a man who is under my protection. Capone's face flushed. He wasn't backing down. I said and he started to repeat the slur, but he didn't get to finish because Luciano's hand moved to his jacket, and suddenly there was a gun, and it was pointed directly at Al Capone's face. The room exploded into motion. Chairs scraped back. Men reached for weapons. Frank Nitti, Capone's enforcer, drew his gun and pointed it at Luciano. Meyer Lansky, who had been standing against the wall, pulled his own weapon. Within seconds, 6 guns were drawn and aimed, and the most powerful criminals in America were frozen in a standoff where one wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, one panic shot would start a war that would destroy them all. Joe Bonanno was shouting for calm. Tommy Galliano had his hands raised, trying to get everyone to lower their weapons. Vincent Mangano was backing toward the door, trying to get out of the line of fire. And Lucky Luciano stood perfectly still, his gun steady, aimed at Al Capone's head, his finger on the trigger, his eyes locked on Capone's face. You will not, Luciano said, his voice shaking with rage. You will not disrespect someone under my protection. You will not use that word in this room. You will not question my judgment about who I choose to work with. You are not the boss of bosses. We killed the boss of bosses. We created this commission so that no one man could dictate to everyone else. And if you think you can walk in here and override my decisions, if you think you can insult my allies and face no consequences, Then you go ahead and draw your weapon, and we will settle this right now." Capone stared at Luciano, and for a moment everyone thought the shooting would start. Capone's hand was on his own gun. Frank Nitty's gun was already drawn. The math was impossible. If shooting started, people would die, probably lots of people, and the commission would be destroyed, and federal agents who had been looking for an opportunity to bring down organized crime would have all the evidence they needed that these men were violent criminals who needed to be locked away forever. But Al Capone, for all his faults, was not stupid. Drunk, yes. Angry, yes. Racist, absolutely. But not stupid. He looked at Luciano's face and saw something that made him hesitate. Lucky Luciano was not bluffing. This was not a negotiating tactic or a theatrical display. Luciano would pull that trigger. He would kill Al Capone right here in this room in front of all these witnesses, and he would accept the consequences, because the alternative, letting Capone insult Bumpy Johnson and undermine the alliance, was worse than war. Capone saw that and understood that he had miscalculated. He had thought Luciano's alliance with black criminals was a sign of weakness, an indication that Luciano was soft, willing to compromise fundamental principles for money. He had been wrong. Luciano's alliance was a sign of strength, an indication that he was willing to fight anyone, including the most famous gangster in America, to protect the rules of the commission and the sanctity of his agreements. Slowly, very slowly, Capone moved his hand away from his gun. He leaned back in his chair. He picked up his cigar, which had been smoldering in an ashtray. He took a long pull, let the smoke out slowly. Then he spoke. "I apologize." The words were quiet, grudging, but they were clear enough for everyone to hear. Luciano didn't move, didn't lower his gun, didn't respond. He just stood there, waiting. Capone understood what was required. He cleared his throat. "I apologize," he said again, more clearly this time, for what I said about Johnson. It was disrespectful and inappropriate. Luciano held his position for another 5 seconds, letting the apology hang in the air, making sure everyone understood that it had been given and accepted. Then, slowly, he lowered his gun. He placed it on the table in front of him. He sat down, and he looked around the room at all the other bosses who were still holding weapons. "Put them away," he said quietly. "All of you. This meeting is not over. We have business to discuss." One by one, the other men holstered their weapons. Frank Nitti was the last, his gun still pointed at Luciano until Capone nodded permission for him to stand down. Then the guns were away, and men were sitting down, and the room was filled with the sound of chairs scraping and nervous laughter, and the release of tension that had almost killed them all. Lucky Luciano picked up his glass of wine, took a sip, and continued as if nothing had happened. "As I was saying," he said calmly, "I'm proposing that we officially recognize Harlem as organized territory. The numbers operation there will pay tribute and operate under our rules. In exchange, we will protect them from independent operators like Dutch Schultz who are causing problems. All Italian operations in Harlem will be coordinated through my family to avoid conflicts. Is there any objection to this arrangement?" Nobody spoke, not because they all agreed, but because they had just seen Lucky Luciano pull a gun on Al Capone and force an apology, and they understood that objecting to the Harlem arrangement now would be seen as siding with Capone against Luciano, and nobody wanted to do that. So they nodded. They agreed. They voted to recognize Harlem as protected territory. And just like that, Bumpy Johnson became the first black criminal in American history to operate under the protection of the Italian Mafia's commission. He didn't know it yet. He was in Harlem, going about his business, completely unaware that in a restaurant in Little Italy, Lucky Luciano had just put a gun to the head of the most famous gangster in America to protect his dignity and his right to operate. But he would find out soon enough. The meeting ended an hour later with all the normal formalities. Territories were divided, profits were allocated, future meetings were scheduled. Everyone shook hands and left in their separate cars with their armed escorts, but everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The commission had almost destroyed itself over a question of race, and it had survived only because Lucky Luciano was willing to kill to protect his black ally. That sent a message that nobody could ignore. It said that Luciano's word was absolute, that his protection meant something, that questioning his judgment was a mortal insult. but it also created resentment. Al Capone left that meeting humiliated. He had been forced to apologize in front of his peers for expressing opinions that most of them shared. He had been made to look weak, to back down, to acknowledge that Lucky Luciano was more powerful than he was. And Capone was not the kind of man who forgot humiliation. He would remember this, and when the opportunity came to hurt Luciano, to undermine his authority, to prove that protecting black criminals was a mistake, Capone would take it. The war hadn't started that day, but the seeds of it had been planted. Lucky Luciano met with Bumpy Johnson 3 days after the commission meeting. They met in the same Harlem restaurant late at night, just the two of them and a handful of guards. Luciano told Bumpy what had happened. He didn't minimize it or make himself sound heroic. He just laid out the facts. Capone had used a racial slur. Luciano had responded by drawing his weapon. Capone had apologized. The commission had approved the Harlem arrangement. Bumpy listened to all of this in silence, his face expressionless. When Luciano finished, Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that Luciano had been expecting. Why did you do it? Why did you risk your life, risk a war with Al Capone, risk everything? For me? I didn't do it for you, Luciano said. I did it for me. I did it because if I let Capone talk about you that way, if I let him dismiss you as less than human, then I'm admitting that power and alliances and agreements mean nothing if you're the wrong color. And once I admit that, once I say that some people don't deserve respect no matter how capable they are, then the whole system falls apart. Because then it becomes about who's Italian enough, who's white enough, who's from the right neighborhood, who has the right last name. It becomes about everything except ability and results. And I don't want to run an organization based on that kind of stupidity. Bumpy Johnson studied Lucky Luciano's face, trying to determine if this was genuine or just more manipulation. But Luciano's expression was open, honest, almost vulnerable. He meant what he was saying. He had put a gun to Al Capone's head, not out of personal affection for Bumpy Johnson, but because he believed in a principle, that competence should matter more than color, that an alliance once made should be honored, that the rules of the commission applied to everyone, or they applied to no one. It was a cold principle, a pragmatic principle, but it was also a revolutionary principle in 1931 America. And Bumpy Johnson understood in that moment that he had just become part of something much larger than the numbers game in Harlem. He had become a test case for whether the criminal underworld could evolve beyond the racial hierarchies that defined American society. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. And that meant his life was about to get much more complicated. The alliance between Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson transformed Harlem. Dutch Schultz, who had been terrorizing numbers operators, suddenly found himself frozen out. When he tried to strong-arm one of Stephanie St. Clair's operations, he got a visit from Frank Costello, one of Luciano's top lieutenants, who explained very politely that Harlem was now protected territory and any violence there would be seen as an attack on Luciano's family. Schultz complained to the commission, but Luciano had the votes, and Schultz's complaint was dismissed. Other Italian gangsters who had been eyeing Harlem's profits got the same message: stay out, or face the consequences. For the first time in years, the black numbers operators could run their businesses without constant threat of Italian takeover. They paid their tribute to Luciano, they followed the commission's rules about violence and territorial boundaries, and in exchange they were left alone. It was a good deal. It was a great deal. And it made Bumpy Johnson very, very powerful. But power always comes with a price, and Bumpy's price was that he became a target. Every Italian gangster who resented Luciano's protection of black criminals saw Bumpy as a symbol of everything wrong with the new commission. Every old guard boss who thought the mob should remain exclusively Italian saw Bumpy as a contamination, a corruption of their traditions. Every racist criminal, and there were many, saw Bumpy as an opportunity. If they could kill him, if they could break Luciano's protection, then they could prove that alliances with black criminals were doomed to fail and that the natural racial order should be restored. So Bumpy Johnson spent the years from 1931 to 1935 constantly watching his back, constantly aware that someone might try to kill him, not because of anything he had done, but because of what he represented. He survived 3 assassination attempts in those years. The first was Sloppy, an amateur hired by a disgruntled numbers operator who felt that Bumpy's alliance with Luciano had sold out the black community. Bumpy's guards killed the shooter before he got close. The second was more professional, a team of 3 gunmen who ambushed Bumpy's car on a Harlem street. Bumpy survived by throwing himself out of the moving vehicle and rolling behind a parked car while his driver was killed. The shooters escaped but were found dead 2 days later, killed by Luciano's men in retaliation. The third attempt was the most sophisticated. A bomber planted explosives in Bumpy's apartment building, timed to go off when Bumpy was home. But Bumpy had gotten cautious. He varied his routine, never slept in the same place 2 nights in a row, and that night he happened to be staying with a friend. The bomb went off and killed 3 people, none of them Bumpy. Luciano was furious. He put out word that whoever was behind these attempts needed to stop immediately or face consequences that would destroy their entire family. The attempt stopped. Not because people stopped hating Bumpy Johnson, but because they understood that Lucky Luciano's protection was real and absolute. Al Capone went to prison in 1932, convicted of income tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years. He served his time in Alcatraz, the escape-proof island prison in San Francisco Bay, and by the time he was released in 1939, his health was broken and his mind was deteriorating from untreated syphilis. He never regained his power. He never got his revenge on Lucky Luciano. He died in 1947, and at his funeral, none of the major mob bosses attended. He had been forgotten, a relic of an earlier, more violent era. But before he went to prison, before the disease destroyed his mind, Al Capone spent months obsessing about the commission meeting where Luciano had humiliated him. He told his closest associates that Luciano's protection of that slur, he still used it, couldn't help himself from using it, was a sign that Luciano had gotten soft, that he cared more about money than about principle, that he had betrayed everything the Italian mob stood for. Capone said that history would prove him right, that Luciano's alliance with black criminals would eventually destroy him. He was wrong about that, as he was wrong about so many things. But he was right about one thing: the alliance did have consequences that nobody anticipated. The protection that Lucky Luciano extended to Bumpy Johnson created a precedent. Other Italian bosses started making their own arrangements with black criminals, with Puerto Rican gangs, with anyone who could help them make money. The strict ethnic boundaries that had defined the mob for decades started to blur. Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky became full partners rather than junior associates. Irish criminals started working directly with Italian families. And in Harlem, Chicago, Detroit, and other cities with large black populations, powerful black criminals started operating under the protection of Italian crime families, paying tribute but maintaining their independence. It was a slow transformation, taking decades to fully develop, but it fundamentally changed organized crime in America. And it all started with Lucky Luciano pulling a gun on Al Capone in defense of a 25-year-old black enforcer that most people had never heard of. Bumpy Johnson went on to become one of the most powerful criminals in New York. He outlasted Dutch Schultz, who was killed in 1935 in a hit that many believe Bumpy was involved in orchestrating. He outlasted Lucky Luciano, who was deported to Italy in 1946. He outlasted most of the men who had been at that commission meeting in 1931, watching as they died, went to prison, or retired. Bumpy kept operating in Harlem for over 30 years, eventually transitioning from the numbers game to heroin trafficking, becoming a major figure in the French connection network that smuggled drugs from Europe to America. He was arrested dozens of times but never convicted of anything serious. He maintained his alliance with various Italian families, always paying tribute, always honoring agreements, always staying within the rules of organized crime. And when he died of a heart attack in 1968, sitting in a Harlem restaurant eating breakfast, representatives from all 5 families attended his funeral. They came to pay respects to a man who had broken barriers, who had proved that competence and intelligence mattered more than race, who had survived in a world that was designed to crush people like him. They came because Bumpy Johnson had become something remarkable, a black gangster who earned the respect of the Italian Mafia through ability, not through submission. Lucky Luciano never stopped defending that decision he made in November 1931. Years later, after he had been deported to Italy and was living in exile, A reporter asked him about his relationship with black criminals and whether he regretted the controversy it had caused. Luciano's response was vintage. He laughed, lit a cigarette, and said regret was for people who made mistakes, and protecting Bumpy Johnson wasn't a mistake. It was good business. Bumpy made me a lot of money. He kept Harlem stable. He honored every agreement we ever made. And he was smarter than 90% of the Italian soldiers I commanded. Why would I regret protecting him? Because he was black? Because some racist idiots couldn't see past the color of his skin? Those idiots lost money. Those idiots started wars. Those idiots ended up dead or in prison. And I ended up rich and powerful. So you tell me who made the better decision? The reporter pressed, but didn't the alliance with Johnson cause problems within the commission? Didn't it create resentment and division? Luciano stubbed out his cigarette and gave the reporter a look that made him step back. Everything causes resentment and division. That's what happens when you put powerful men in a room together. They fight over scraps like dogs. What matters is whether you fight over something real or something imaginary. Territory is real. Money is real. Power is real. The color of someone's skin is imaginary. It doesn't affect whether they can shoot straight, whether they can run a numbers game, whether they can keep their mouth shut when the cops come asking questions. All that matters is whether they can do the job. Bumpy could do the job. End of story. But it wasn't the end of the story. The story continued for decades after that commission meeting, rippling out in ways that nobody could have predicted. The precedent that Luciano set by protecting Bumpy Johnson influenced how later mob bosses dealt with non-Italian criminals. When Frank Costello took over Luciano's operations, he maintained and expanded alliances with black criminals in multiple cities. When Carlo Gambino became boss of his family in the 1950s, he explicitly stated that he would work with anyone who could make money and follow rules, regardless of their background. Even Vito Genovese, who despised the idea of working with non-Italians, found himself forced to honor arrangements that Luciano had made because breaking them would have caused too much disruption. The alliance that started in a Harlem restaurant and was defended at gunpoint in a Little Italy meeting room became official policy for the American Mafia, codified in the Commission's rules, accepted by even the most racist bosses because they couldn't argue with the results. And what were the results? The results were that organized crime in America became more profitable, more stable, and more difficult for law enforcement to combat. When the Italian mob was fighting with black criminals over territory, when violence was constant and bodies were piling up, the police could justify crackdowns and federal intervention. But when the violence decreased, when territories were organized and disputes were settled through negotiation rather than machine gun fire, the public pressure on police diminished. Citizens didn't care if criminals were making money as long as they weren't killing each other in the streets. Politicians didn't want to spend resources fighting crime that wasn't disrupting their constituents' lives. And so organized crime flourished, making billions of dollars over the decades, precisely because men like Lucky Luciano understood that cooperation was more profitable than warfare, and that cooperation required transcending the racial barriers that divided American society. There's a deeper story here too, one that goes beyond gangsters and gunfights and commission meetings. It's a story about what happens when practical necessity forces people to confront their prejudices. Lucky Luciano didn't protect Bumpy Johnson because he was a civil rights hero or because he believed in racial equality. He protected Bumpy because it served his interests, because Bumpy was useful, because the alliance made him money and power. It was a purely pragmatic decision. But pragmatism has consequences. When Luciano defended Bumpy at that commission meeting, when he drew his gun on Al Capone, he established a principle that went beyond business calculations. He established that ability mattered more than race, that agreements once made must be honored regardless of who made them, that respect could be earned even by people that society considered inferior. He probably didn't think about it in those terms. He probably just saw it as enforcing commission rules and protecting his prerogatives. But the effect was the same. He forced the most powerful criminals in America to acknowledge that a black man could be worthy of respect and protection. He made them treat Bumpy Johnson as an equal, even if they didn't believe in equality, and in doing so, he created space for other black criminals to rise, to build their own empires, to operate with a level of security and legitimacy that would have been impossible without that precedent. That's the strange, morally complicated lesson of this story. Progress doesn't always come from heroes. Sometimes it comes from villains who make ruthlessly practical decisions that happen to undermine the systems of oppression they don't even care about. Lucky Luciano wasn't trying to fight racism when he protected Bumpy Johnson. But he did fight it, in his own way, by refusing to let racial prejudice override sound business judgment. And that refusal, that insistence on competence over color, had effects that rippled far beyond the criminal underworld. Because once people see that racial barriers can be crossed in one context, they start to question why those barriers exist in other contexts. If a black gangster can be competent enough to earn Mafia protection, then why can't a black doctor be competent enough to treat white patients? If a black enforcer can be intelligent enough to strategize with Italian bosses, then why can't a black student be intelligent enough to attend a white school? The logic of Luciano's pragmatism, once unleashed, undermined the entire structure of segregation and white supremacy. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, over decades, creating precedents and possibilities that people like Bumpy Johnson exploited to build lives and careers that the previous generation could never have imagined. Bumpy Johnson understood this. In interviews late in his life, he talked about how the alliance with Luciano had changed not just his personal fortune, but the entire landscape of black crime and black opportunity in Harlem. Before Luciano's protection, Bumpy said, black criminals were prey. They built something, and white criminals took it. They made money, and white criminals stole it. They tried to organize, and white criminals smashed them with violence and police collusion. There was no path forward, no way to accumulate power, no security. But after Luciano extended his protection, after the commission recognized Harlem as organized territory, everything changed. Black criminals could plan for the future. They could invest their profits in legitimate businesses. They could send their children to good schools. They could build wealth that would survive them. And all of that was possible because Lucky Luciano had been willing to pull a gun on Al Capone in defense of a principle that he didn't even fully understand the implications of. Bumpy said that he owed his life to Luciano multiple times, not because Luciano saved him from assassination attempts, but because Luciano gave him something more valuable than safety: respect. The knowledge that his abilities mattered, that his intelligence was recognized, that he was valued for what he could do rather than diminished for what he looked like. That knowledge, Bumpy said, was worth more than all the money he ever made. The story of that commission meeting in November 1931 eventually became legend in the criminal underworld. Details were embellished. People who weren't there claimed they were. The exact words that were said got distorted through decades of retelling. But the core truth remained. Lucky Luciano drew a gun on Al Capone in defense of a black criminal, and in doing so, changed the rules of organized crime forever. That moment became a touchstone, a story that was told to new recruits to teach them how the commission worked, how seriously alliances were taken, how absolutely protection was enforced. It became a warning to anyone who thought they could disrespect someone under Mafia protection. Luciano had been willing to start a war over it, and his successors would be too. And it became an inspiration to black criminals who were trying to build their own organizations. If Bumpy Johnson could earn Mafia protection, then so could they. All they had to do was be smart enough, tough enough, and professional enough to prove they were worth protecting. Today, more than 90 years after that commission meeting, the criminal underworld that Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson helped shape is barely recognizable. The Italian Mafia is a shadow of what it was, weakened by RICO prosecutions, internal warfare, and competition from other criminal organizations. The numbers game that sustained Harlem's economy for decades has been replaced by state lotteries that generate billions in legal revenue. Bumpy Johnson's heroin empire has been superseded by new generations of drug traffickers using different routes and different strategies. Almost everyone who attended that commission meeting is dead, their empires dissolved, their legacies debated by historians and criminologists. But the principle that Luciano fought for in that room remains relevant. That competence should matter more than identity, that alliances once made should be honored, that respect should be earned through ability rather than granted or denied based on accidents of birth. Those principles matter as much today as they did in 1931, maybe more, because we're still fighting about them. We're still arguing about whether ability or identity should determine opportunity. We're still dealing with people who think that some groups are inherently superior to others. We're still confronting the legacy of racism that men like Al Capone embodied, and that men like Lucky Luciano, for all their moral failings in other areas, refuse to accept as the basis for business decisions. That's the strange, uncomfortable truth that this story reveals. Sometimes the villains are more progressive than the heroes. Lucky Luciano was a murderer, a racketeer, a criminal who caused immense suffering and destroyed countless lives. But on the question of whether ability or race should determine who deserves respect and protection, he was more enlightened than most legitimate businessmen and politicians of his era. He saw clearly what others refused to see: that prejudice was expensive, that discrimination was inefficient, that judging people by their color rather than their competence was stupid and self-defeating. He didn't learn this from moral philosophy or religious teaching. He learned it from hard experience, from watching racist bosses like Al Capone make bad decisions based on irrational hatreds, from understanding that in his business, survival required being smarter than your competitors and more rational in your judgments. And so he made a rational judgment that Bumpy Johnson was worth protecting, even if it meant confronting the most famous gangster in America. That judgment, made in a smoke-filled room in 1931, changed American organized crime forever. And it taught a lesson that remains relevant almost a century later, that progress sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, driven by the most unexpected people, for the most unexpected reasons. But it comes nonetheless if someone is brave enough or practical enough or ruthless enough to stand up and say this system is stupid, these rules are counterproductive, and I'm going to do things differently no matter who objects. Lucky Luciano said that, and he backed it up with a gun pointed at Al Capone's head. And because of that moment, because of that decision, the world changed just a little bit, in ways that neither man fully understood, but both men helped create.